I'd like to welcome you all to our 9th and second to last session called Black Economic Empowerment and Performance in South Africa. The presentation will be done by Dr. Stephen Gelb, who we are very grateful for, and he will be joined on stage by Natasha Marrian, who is Senior Researcher at the BER, Khulekani Mathe, who is Chief Executive Officer at Business Unity South Africa, and Vuyo Jack, the founder and executive chairman at Empowerdex. Stephen, we welcome you. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And let me first say that I think it was maybe a good idea to put the BE session right after lunch on Friday, because I think it's one that will keep people awake and focused on the issues. But before I start, I also want to just thank, firstly, the BER, and particularly Roy Haverman and Johan Kirsten for sort of engaging me to do this piece of work, and secondly, ERSA and Fushi and Claudine for making it possible for me to be here. As Fushi said, I'm based in London. I think he said it. I'm based in London. Working as an independent consultant on development issues, and it's always a very good idea to come to Cape Town in March and have a bit of sun and a bit of holiday, so I'm grateful for that. And then the second thing I want to say by way of introduction is that this is the first piece of work that I've done on South Africa, really, for the last 13 or so years. So there may be a few gaps in my knowledge, but I hope I'll do it justice. I think it's a very important issue. I've put on this slide just a quick outline, which I won't actually spend any time on, about what I'm going to go through, except to say that I'll look a little bit at the history of BEE, which I think is very important, particularly because I want to make this presentation paper about BEE's relationship with economic growth, not just to look at it sort of in its own right. And I look at the history a bit, and then I look at what's going on now. And then I move on to just two issues I want to mention from a sort of theory point of view about BEE and growth. And I won't go through all the details on the slide. I actually can't see it. My eyes are not good enough to see that screen over there. But basically, the first thing I want to say is that, well, let me start by saying I wrote a paper about BEE in 2007. I've done a few other bits of work on BEE, but in 2007 I wrote a paper with Jim Robinson and Darren Asamoglu, who were somewhat famous then, but are much more famous now. Jim Robinson came to South Africa as part of the Danny Roderick, Ricardo Hausman team from Harvard. And I had met him once or twice before that, so when I saw him here, he said, "I've come here in this team, but I don't know what I'm supposed to do." I said to him, he said, "What do you think I should do?" So I said, "Nobody in your group is looking at BEE. And I think it's a very important issue for somebody in the group to look at, because from a growth point of view, it's critical." And I said, "I think you're the right guy to do it." He said, "Okay, I'll do it if you join me in writing the paper." So we ended up writing this paper, and I'll talk a little bit more about it now. But there's a lot of problems in the paper, so I wouldn't necessarily go and reread it if I were you. But that's sort of something just for the background. One of the things that we said in the paper, and which I think the South African experience underlines, is that the process of BEE, or making a big distributional shift, as we have tried to do in the last 30 years in South Africa, requires what we call in development economics a big push. In other words, public-led action to disturb the current equilibrium, in other words, the distribution of assets as it was in the early 90s, in other words, almost entirely white-owned, and change that to make it more black-owned. So it needs some kind of public action. It's not just going to happen through market processes undisturbed. And that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is one that I already made in the 1990s, and I think is still very true, and that is what BEE does is it alters the distribution of rents within the economy to give more rents to black people, owners, managers, skilled workers in particular, to a lesser extent community groups and so on. But it does give rents to those people. It also, I think, changes the distribution, given the way the regulations have happened, for the large companies that have transformed their ownership and management, and they also get rents because they are more eligible for contracts, whether from public or private sector. But looking at the rent issues, I think, is a very important connection between BEE as a distributional process and its impact on growth, because those people who get rents can then have the opportunity to decide what to do with those rents in the future. So those are the sort of two key theoretical points. So I'll then just go through what I call the sort of 2 or 3 phases of BEE as we've experienced it since 1994. The first phase being what I've called then the narrow-based phase of BEE from 1993, actually before democracy was installed, up until 1999. And I think one point that is important to make, given the history of BEE, is that in the early 90s, when we were working on, many of us here and elsewhere, were working on ANC economic policy, not enough attention was paid to the question of black ownership of assets and how that would happen effectively. There was, of course, some work from NAFCOC at the time, but they were somewhat distinct even then from the ANC, and at the leaders of the ANC were not all that focused on changing corporate ownership. They were much more interested, and we were much more interested in transforming monopoly power, and particularly of the white-owned corporation. So there was little cooperation and coordination between government and big business at the time. So as we know, I think the initial BEE process was actually business-led, driven by individual firms and not by policy, not by government policy after 1994. The focus was very much on ownership and the board of directors. It was, as I say, they're voluntary, decentralized, and incremental. So individual corporations decided what to do and when to do it, and many of them didn't do very much at all. Affirmative action and enterprise development were completely separate policy arenas, not connected with black empowerment at all. And there was different initiatives which were undertaken at that time. So what that did was, at least provisionally, secure property rights, as it was intended to do by the white-owned corporations that were changing their ownership. They were worried about property rights during the transitional period, and bringing a few black people onto their boards and with shares, particularly people who were very well politically connected with the ANC, helped to secure property rights, at least in the short term. For the firms themselves, that provided some access to government contracts and some input into regulations and policy processes at the time. But in 1998, as I think everybody will remember, or at least those of us old enough will remember, a lot of this unraveled in the context of a JSE crash, and many of the deals went, as we said, underwater. They were no longer financially viable for the new owners of shares. There's very little data, I think, on the impact of that first phase on economic growth, but we also know that investment generally and economic growth generally remain very low because there was a reluctance of the large corporations in the country to invest. They were waiting to really understand a bit better what the ANC was all about in terms of its economic policy. But I think one important thing that I want to say here is that already at that time, this narrowly based BEE set a kind of tone for the impact on economic growth of BEE, because there was a flaw in what I would call the institutional structure of the rent bargain around BEE, in the sense that there was no reciprocity, no link back from change in the BEE structure, the black ownership structure of corporations, to what use was made of the rents that resulted both for black owners, new black owners, but also for the white corporations as a result of that change. And so there was no connection with investment and therefore with productivity improvements and economic growth. So it was kind of separated already at that time, BEE, from the economic growth process. So then, as we know, in 1998, things started to fall apart, and BEE shifted to what I call a new phase. The first process here was the government setting up the BEE Commission, which was actually chaired by President Ramaphosa, not president then, of course, but one of the BEE beneficiaries. That was set up in 1998, reported in 2001 in response to that financial crash. It was somewhat statutory, as I said, quasi-statutory, not a government body, but connected with the government. And it recommended that the government get involved and undertake this big push process that I mentioned earlier. In other words, engage in public action. And I have a quote there from the BEE report of 2001. It's been a fundamental pillar of government policies. I'm not sure that was entirely accurate at the time, but it's not been implemented in a coordinated and integrated fashion, and there needs to be more coherence and uniformity in BEE policy. Now, in doing this work, I went back and reread that BEE Com report of 2001, and I strongly recommend that people do that if they want to understand some of the history. Because, I mentioned there 3 things that they did there in that report, what they recommended. The first was they argued for a 10-year time horizon for BEE, from the implementation for another 10 years. In other words, a fixed time period. The second thing is that they returned to these 3, 4, 5, 6 targets that had originally been developed by NAFCOC, and they said we need to think through those and put those on the table, looking at directors, 30% directors, 40% equity ownership, 50% of inputs, and 60% of management. Those were the targets that they laid out. And then I think most importantly, we need to look at the order of the chapters in that report, because chapter 1 in the BEE Com report was about economic growth. The focus was on raising aggregate investment in the economy to 25%. We would be so lucky to have 25% today. But that's what they saw as how the contribution that BEE could make was to raise that investment target and support economic growth. After that, they had chapters on human resources and on access to capital and financial services for black people, very much with a broad-based focus. And then eventually in chapter 7, they started talking about BEE as we kind of came to know it. In other words, the ownership, the management, and changes in the way that corporations were structured in that regard. So they really promoted what I call their voluntary sector-based deracialization targets and mechanisms back in 2001. But we know, of course, that although the government sort of adopted the report in some sense, they didn't actually follow the advice that was given by the BEE Com report and hasn't done since then. The next thing I want to talk about is another initiative which came out in 2003, and this came from Anglo American, from Nicky Oppenheimer, actually. It was called the Brenthurst Initiative. And that's also really worth going back and rereading at this point, because he argued very strongly, and of course he was like the number one capitalist in the economy at the time, Anglo-American. He argued very strongly we must have BEE in South Africa. It's very important for the stability of the economy and the polity, and it's also very important, he said, to lower risk in order to encourage foreign direct investment to come into South Africa. You know, it was laid out in a like 35-page brochure, which he signed. I don't know who wrote it, but he signed it. And he said, this is what we need to do. He accepted the need for a big push for some kind of state action, but he linked that big push very directly to economic growth and spelled out how he thought BEE could operate to support economic growth in the economy as a whole. What he proposed was to link BEE to corporate investment, essentially by connecting compliant white corporations that changed their ownership with tax cuts. So he was trying to shift the cost of BEE, some of the rents, away from corporations as it had been to the taxpayer. And he said, if we get the tax cuts, if corporations get the tax cuts, then they will have more to invest, and they will invest. A big problem, though, with what he said was there was no compulsion to sort of force corporations who did get tax cuts to actually invest. So the mechanism proposed was ex post rather than ex ante. It didn't really work. But the other things he said were also very interesting. A fixed time frame, 10 to 15 years was proposed, a fixed scorecard for BEE targets. But he also said that those targets should be raised over that 10 to 15-year time frame. And firms that don't comply, white-owned firms that don't comply, must be penalized with heavier taxes rather than tax cuts. And this, I think, was also very important. And then he talked a lot, and I want to emphasize this today, given current government policy, he talked a lot about the need to mobilize all sorts of finance. And I have a quote there, all available sources, be creative and innovative, talked about compulsory savings, he talked about prescribed assets, institutional special purpose vehicles, individual investments, and private equity. All of those things he explicitly mentioned in this pamphlet. And then he said also this process will lower risk and lead to more FDI, but also at the same time we should be looking for grants and private indirect investments to come in. So that was very important. What was so interesting to me, and I only discovered, I didn't really notice it at the time, I must admit, in 2003, but later when I did start working a bit more on BEE, I came across it, and I was very surprised that it had so little public debate. I don't understand why. Because what was also interesting was that it was signed by Nicky Oppenheimer, but the foreword in the brochure was written by Thabo Mbeki, the president, implicitly supporting what was in the brochure. One imagined, why else would he write the foreword? And yet government kind of dismissed it out of hand for reasons that I do not know, actually, but I think we need to also go back to that Brenthurst brochure and just at least talk about it some more and see what light it sheds on the dilemmas we face today. Anyway, we then moved on to broad-based BEE from 2000, or really 2003, to, I've said there, 2019, where the government adopted a big push policy, but without adhering to the growth-oriented approach from BCom or from Brenthurst. The approach shifted away from a business-led approach in phase one to more of a market-led, sectoral-led approach in phase two. Business more or less accepted this big push policy, and the Brenthurst approach had sort of suggested they would do that. And despite the shift to a number of different domains, it seemed to me that ownership still remained the headline focus. The changes in ownership remained the headline focus. We had the scorecards and the charters, industry and sector charters were developed from 2001 onwards, and then eventually legislated. The levers that were used were essentially procurement, both public and private sector procurement through the 2000 Act, and the sort of cascading backwards as a result of that. In 2007 and then again in 2013, there were adjustments to the code, and I sort of call that BEE Phase 2A. But this, and actually they brought in enterprise and supplier development in 2015 in these new codes for the first time. That's important now. Phase 2 had very little policy focus, as far as I can tell, on three important issues. The first was the financing of BEE, which happened in a range of different ways, either vendor finance or institution finance, but there was no sort of system to it, and also I think no connection between the finance that companies and banks and lending institutions were giving to BEE and what that meant for their general lending to the companies for investment and expansion and the things we've been talking about the last 2 days. The second thing connected with that, no connection with investment and growth and BEE changes. And then, that's obviously very important, but that sort of continued the tone from the first phase, the narrowly based phase. And the third thing was no time frames were given as to how long this should last for. So I would argue that there has been limited success in BEE, and I'm really drawing here mostly on the work done by Empowerdex and subsequently called Crutum, and Stuart Theobald and his colleagues. I think Peter Montalto was here. I don't know if he's still here, but they've done a lot of good work, and I'm drawing mostly on that. But very limited success. Ownership and management targets are largely addressed, but if you look at the percentage of BEE in ownership or in management, it remains very, very low. So the target for ownership is 25%, and the latest Gauge report, which covers about 14,000 companies in the country, so it's very comprehensive, it basically says around 81% of the target is achieved, but that essentially means 20% of the ownership has shifted to black people. Not 80% achieved, but only of 25%. Transactions now are down because most of the large corporations have already done BEE deals. The stock value has gone down, as I mentioned there. The management target, 20% shift in management, that's around 70% achieved, 69%, but that also means only around 17% of management has been changed from white people to black people. And only 20% of firms have a level 1 BEE rating, 20% are non-compliant. What I also find a bit shocking in reading all this data, and I hope I've made sense of it, is that 42% of public agencies, government agencies, SOEs, universities, and so on, only 42% are compliant. I would have thought it would be much higher than that, but it's not. So BEE performance is mixed in terms of ownership and management targets, and I think today, just reading the media coverage, as I have been doing, there's a deep division between people who argue that the policy must be extended, given that these targets are actually, what has been achieved is not actually very strong at this point, and those people who are very concerned, particularly around governance issues in the public policy interventions related to BEE. Just moving on the limited success, I've got some data which I got from BER and a company called 71.4 looking at employment equity. I won't go through this very much, but it basically shows essentially that there has been quite a lot done on employment equity, although as you sort of move to more senior occupational and managerial positions, the performance goes down. The public sector has done much stronger than the private sector. Within the private sector, banking has done better than any other of the, well, they look at 4 sectors: manufacturing, retail and IT and banking and financial services, I guess, has done much better than the other three sectors. And then, very predictably, sad to say, gender representation, leaving aside race, across races, and certainly for black women, gender representation is much worse than it should be. So now moving on to the rest of, the next important thing that I want to talk about is that BE has not helped to build successful black-owned small and medium enterprises, SMEs. The ESD, the Enterprise and Supplier Development Target, is 3% of after-tax profits. If you look at the scorecards, and actually these come from the BE Commission, Chidisa Matone is here, and it's, from his organization, 75.6% of the target has been achieved. But the problem with this is that this is focused on inputs, how much money has been spent, as opposed to the outputs, that is, how many enterprises have become successful. And if you look at what BEECOM says about the funds, only 46% roughly of the 26 billion of ESD funds supplied or spent in 2021, which I think is the most recent year, was spent. The rest was unspent. 54% roughly was unspent. And even more shocking, I think, in their results from their survey is that 62% of corporate entities do not have an ESD strategy. They just don't have a strategy. So they're willing to sort of spend the money because they have to, but they don't really care too much about using it to improve black-owned enterprises and black-owned suppliers. And then look briefly here, because I think it's important to bring this in, at individual incentives and what that means in terms of people's choices, young black people's choices between going into managerial and professional categories, particularly in the corporations, and becoming entrepreneurs. And it seems to me that there are two very big blockages, obstacles to black people going for entrepreneurship. The first one is the so-called black tax that people, many people have to pay to family members, which provides a big incentive to go for a larger salary in the short term. And the second thing is the obstacles facing new businesses. Labor issues, infrastructure issues, we've talked about all this for the last 2 days, market concentration and access to finance. All of those things make setting up and running a small business much more difficult if you can get a job as a manager in a large corporation and be relatively assured of a high salary, which you can then use for your personal advancement. So that has meant that affirmative action has been supported rather than entrepreneurs. So I then move on, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. I just move on to look at 3 papers. There's actually only, I think, about 5 or 6 papers looking at BE and growth. And I just talk very briefly about 3. The first one is the one that I was involved in 2007. I'm not going to go through it all in detail, but the big problem with that paper, one of the problems with that paper, is that we did it very early. 2007, the codes had just been set up. There weren't proper systems in place, but we essentially showed using somewhat sophisticated econometrics that BE had very little impact on economic growth. And we made the one thing I will say is we made 3 recommendations to Trevor Manuel, who was the Minister of Finance, who commissioned this work, which were all ignored, as we knew they would be when we made them, but we made them anyway. So the first was to raise the weights of enterprise and supplier development and of skills in the sort of BE clock, if you like, the in other words, lower the weight of ownership and of management and raise the weights of skills development and ESD. Secondly, we said impose a 10-year time frame and announce that that's going to happen now, well, 2007, 8, that it's going to end soon. And then the third thing is improve data by linking reporting and auditing of the accounts of the corporation so that we could track and monitor what was going on. Well, those weren't followed, but we knew they wouldn't be. Subsequently, there have been 2 other papers done which also show that the connection between BEE and growth is not going to be tracked by looking at JSE firms, as we did and as these other 2 papers have done. Some of the details are there. Also, by the way, use the Empowerdex data, which Vuyo has been putting out very helpfully, I think, for at least 20 plus years. But people, those 2 papers looked at turnover, not at profits, as we had looked at, and showed there was some connection between BE and increases in turnover, but we weren't sure, they weren't sure of what that meant for profits, and they couldn't make the same connection between the firm data and changes in productivity. So the connections with growth were also not very well developed. So we then basically what I say in this slide is that we need to change BE, and in particular we need to focus it on improving the numbers of black small and medium-sized enterprises and links to growth. There's some data on this table about the numbers of firms, of SMEs in South Africa. The main thing around that is that South Africa has far fewer SMEs, very well known, I think, far fewer SMEs given the size of the economy. But I think what's also important to underline is that the poor performance generally on economic growth and on inequality and redistribution has again brought to the fore socio-political stability in the sort of medium to long term, in the same way as it was a key issue in the 90s that led to the narrowly based BE at the time. And now we've got a much larger black middle class, but it's important for the black middle class that the issues of inequality and growth are addressed, because their own long-term stability depends in large part on that happening, and that there's no sort of social revolution. An important part of that is improving the numbers and the success rates of black-owned SMEs, in my view. And this has been well known to many people, and in fact the BBBEE Commission has already been signaling this since about 2021-22 for much more focus on enterprise and supplier development. Last year, as many people know, the DTI picked up on those signals and published a draft concept paper in March last year proposing a so-called transformation fund to aggregate and use existing enterprise and supplier development donations. Everybody here who's looked at that paper will know that the draft was very sketchy and undeveloped, the way I put it on the slide, but it indicated the approach to set up a functioning venture capital ecosystem. It came in for very substantial public criticism, which was a good thing, I think, because it was very sketchy and undeveloped. Some of the people who made those criticisms are with us today, which is good. But also the political parties, some of the organizations, and so on. Is it a tax? Is it too focused on inputs rather than outcomes? Will it be wasted by corruption? What about phasing and processes, phasing process and trials and so on? The DTI actually did a slideshow in Parliament, which I tracked down in June, which actually began to respond to some of those criticisms. And then later in 2025, they brought out a much longer and I think much more nuanced version of this transformation fund. And I spent quite a lot of time trying to find that, and eventually I did get hold of a copy and was able to read it. And the rest of what I'm going to say is very much focused on that document. The first thing I want to say is that it's very growth-focused rather than redistribution-focused, which I think was already very important in terms of the longer-term objectives. It's the other thing, which I'll say more than once, it's not in the public domain. I don't know why it's not in the public domain. It took me a while to get hold of it. It was supposed to be launched publicly, but that was cancelled. I don't know why. There's no kind of public recognition of that. Even though the document has not been published, new codes have been published and were gazetted in January. And then a few weeks ago, the President announced a loan from the African Exim Bank, so, which would feed into this. But again, the document hasn't been published. I think I've run out of time, but let me just say a couple of things. I've got some slides on positives, the negatives, and the growth impact. So the first thing to say is I think this is a document that is worth putting out in the public domain and should be discussed publicly by all parties interested in or connected with the BEE arena. It proposes voluntary corporate payments to this fund, the current ESD contributions. The aim, I think, at least as argued there, is to greatly simplify the process for corporations and make it a lot easier for them to engage in BEE, and they get BEE points as a result of doing that. And the point is really to use those funds to build a much more effective and expanded venture capital ecosystem, which South Africa, I think, deeply needs and hasn't got at the moment. So at the moment, we rely primarily on banks and a very small venture capital fund, and that's got to expand. They focus a lot on different issues, the numbers of different kinds of SMEs they talk about, different debt and equity products are talked about. Importantly, 3 tiers of support. They're not just about giving money, and that came through the criticisms for the first document. It's very much also about mentorship, and it's about providing market access. So you've got to have those 3 things working together with companies, and then they talk about monitoring that through IT, and they have some kind of public and private governance process which they are proposing. And they talk about the phased process that needs to happen to set this up. So those are the positives. There are a number of negatives, which I'll just mention very quickly. Many problems. There are different categories of SMEs, but those need different entrepreneurial ecosystems, which is not acknowledged. There's no discussion of the split in the overall pie between these different categories of SMEs, and also mechanisms to allow firms to graduate from smaller to larger as they grow bigger. There's a discussion of milestones, borrow performance milestones, but not very much serious information about what those might look like. I would argue that investment and exports and skills development should be very key in that. And then there's issues around scaling up. So there's a lot of talk about mentorship, but there's no recognition of how many mentors are needed and how many the country is able to supply at this point. There's no discussion of bringing in retired business people to be part of that mentorship group, which I think is potentially a very important resource that we're not using. There's a lot of issues around the governance, which maybe can come up in the discussion, but I think, and about corruption, I think there's a little bit of discussion of that, but that's got to be jacked up very, very substantially, both for the companies that are getting loans, but also for the business development support practitioners, which is obviously a big arena now where there's a lot of corruption going on. And then there's the issues around the exact split between public and private in terms of the governance, who appoints the board and what the functions of the board and so on should be. So I think those are important features which haven't really been addressed, but the document provides a basis for addressing all of that. So just moving on to my last couple of slides about growth, I think this document is a very important starting point, much better, much better, let me say, than the March 25 version, which most people have seen. A starting point for discussing how South Africa can build up black-owned small and medium enterprises, which is something which has to happen, I think, if we're going to get the sorts of economic growth that we've been talking about over the last 2 days. We've got to look at the milestones and how that can operate, and focus, I think, very much there on investment, both by the firms, but also complementary investments by large private firms and by the public sector, and policies of that sort. And then I think there's ways that they can achieve sort of low-hanging fruit, as we say, starting particularly with small and medium enterprises, worrying a bit less about the informal and micro enterprises to build a kind of track record for this process. And that there are ways in which this can be done. It's the sort of thing that's being done, I think, quite effectively in other parts of Africa by African and European funders for SMEs, and we need to actually learn a lot from them in building this. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be done here, which we can talk about, but if the government doesn't put the document out for discussion, it's not going to happen. So that would be my sort of closing point, and sorry for going on. Thank you very much. So I guess now I have to share. Forgot about that. So we've got, this distinguished panel, all of whom know a lot more about this issue than I do. And I think we'll start, I'll just go from my right to my left. So Khulekani from BUSA.
Thanks, Stephen. I deliberately sat far away from you because I didn't want to be the first one to speak. Clearly didn't work. I should have sat in the middle. That would have worked. Look, I think that your account, I think there's not much to disagree with right up to where we are. And I think the only comment I would make is that before we get to the Transformation Fund, is that had the government implemented the recommendation of the BE Commission of giving it a fixed period of 10 years, and then do a proper review of what worked and what hasn't, and then revise the policy accordingly, we probably would have been in a different place. That would have given us something to work with and implement more effective changes. Because we didn't do that, I'm glad the BE Commissioner is here. Because we didn't do that and we just kept on flogging this horse throughout the period, what we could have corrected later, we did not, and we end up in a situation that's not much better many, many years down the line. So I think that is a really missed opportunity. And while that was happening, of course, you then had sort of growing frustration in the population more broadly, just in terms of who is benefiting from this. But you're also getting a lot of frustration from the sort of black business grouping as well. And so all around you have lots of frustrated people. That notwithstanding, I think we should also recognize what I think came earlier in your presentation, that I think BE was seen as important. I don't actually think that people believed the link to growth and investment. I think it was put in there so that you can secure buy-in. I really don't think that there was neither the belief and an effort to make that relationship work. But I think it was important for securing the buy-in. But what it did do is I think it gave us a sense of stability. It kept kind of the social fabric together. The idea that something was being done to address the legacies of the past. With all its problems, the fact that something was being done and that it was government-led has been useful. I think what has not been useful is we did not, as I have said, review and improve going forward. And I think to make a last point, the Transformation Fund, I agree with you, your analysis of the different papers, right to the more recent, as yet not in the public domain. It's a much better document. It did take into consideration some of the earlier criticisms. The codes that were published earlier this year are not in line with the spirit of that revised document. That's created another problem. So people of my clan in the business community had warmed up to the idea set out in the revised document. We're like, okay, can live with this. Might not like all of it, but can live with it. And then the codes, the amendment to the codes came up and everybody's up in arms because of how that is written out. So for instance, it was meant to be an alternative to the existing ESD funds. Some of them don't work very well, but there are some really good ones. And so what it does is the allocation of BE points between those who choose to continue running their own BE funds, those companies that continue running their own BE funds, vis-a-vis those who donate to the Transformation Fund. You get more points for donating to the Transformation Fund to a fund that has no track record, that quite frankly cannot deliver what it promises. Not in the 2, 3, even 5 years. I mean, if we kind of take a much more positive view, perhaps in 5 years you would start to build the necessary system and you might say something. If you take a more negative view and looking at the track record of other sort of government funds, then it has no chance of delivering on this. But in fact, you incentivize people to put money into that black hole. That is the problem that many people are raising. Of course, you have these governance issues that we're all worried about and have raised publicly, but I think in the end, you have a minister who gets onto a public platform and say, I'm going to create a fund that's going to collect 20 billion rand a year. So again, it's about inputs. It's about how much you can collect and spend. He does not tell us, what are you going to achieve with the 20 billion rand a year? You don't find that anywhere. So if you take all of this together, I think it's a wasted opportunity. This was an opportunity for us to really reflect deeply on BE and learn the lessons from what has worked and really try and fix it, because we need a mechanism for addressing the problems that are set out in the various reports. We do need that. There's no doubt about it, at least for me. Anne doesn't agree with that, but I think we need it. And it's unfortunate that I think what we have in the moment does not help us fix and have a proper policy that seeks to address and to your point, create a much more successful black-owned small business sector. Thanks.
Thanks very much. Vuyo.
So, has BE worked to date in terms of its intended design? So when you actually look at the different elements and you look at ownership, and you're so correct, ownership is playing musical chairs. It is not going to generate economic growth.
Yep.
You know that. It's a redistributive mechanism. You just move from white shareholders, and you just then transfer the shares to black shareholders funded by the banks. You worked with the Banking Association.
Why do you bring that up?
So in that, you find that there's not been an impairment of any BE loan from any banks. It's never lost them money. It's been well secured. So it was never ownership. And even if you are able to take broad-based ownership, you have 2 million or 1 million, and you split it amongst 2 million people. It is never going to make any difference because they get 50 cents each. But if you take that ownership element and you give it to 10 people and they have cash in their pocket that can enable to build businesses from scratch, where they are able to have skin in the game and be able to benefit and wake up every day and be able to run their businesses, that's where you're going to make a difference. So ownership was never intended to be able to generate economic growth. It was a redistributive mechanism. Now, I love the way you actually look at the 2007 paper at the rents. So you have to pay the rent to get the political people to be able to say, okay, this is cool, and you can speak to that. However, when you then look at the trajectory to say we need to also follow the money to have employees benefiting in terms of moving from different elements. Employment equity was a dead on arrival policy. Why? Because you know what? To be able to drive and employ black people in all those different areas, you'd rather pay a fine of 500,000 than to actually work at driving employment equity. That's the design of the Act. Now, by linking it to BE, you started seeing employment equity work because you were able to have a hook that drove employment equity that hit the pockets, that you were not going to be looking at paying a fine of 500. So you actually had to go and find black people to be able to employ. And most of black people that are in corporates today have benefited from employment equity. Now, how do we know that? Look at our tax statistics over the years. What is the highest tax that have been collected? There's two. Number one, it is pay as you earn. I mean, it's VAT, because now you employ people, they move. So you make black people to be income statement affluent, so they can spend money. And therefore, they buy new cars, they buy houses, so it drives VAT up, so we're able to increase the collection of VAT, and government is now able to pay and employ more people and pay more interest. Secondly, on the pay-as-you-earn, because they can't do tax planning, so they are forced to pay that pay-as-you-earn. There is no way you would have achieved that without BEE. And you see your tax revenues going up. And now what is the third element? The hook that gave BE to be a business imperative. It came from Trevor Manuel's paper in 1997 of affirmative procurement. And by linking BE, not making it a legal imperative, but a business imperative, you hit people on the procurement, and which is where you are able to say, if you start your company, we give you market access, but because you might not have any experience, so we're also going to give you enterprise development and supplier development in order for you to deliver on that procurement. And that's what made BEE to be a business imperative. And it also had a trickle-down impact in terms of getting companies to contribute. However, it is where it is also lacking, as you put in your data, because it is hard. And why is it hard? Is because now we have followed a scorecard approach that's a tick box approach. What is the minimum that I got to do to be able to get the maximum point? So you're able to game the system, which then limits some of the impact that it could have. And so why is ownership easy to achieve? Why is management easy to achieve? Because you're dealing with a smaller number of people. But when you look at deeply, employment equity is hard, and it's the only output-based indicator in the scorecard, and it's been very hard. And management is easy to change board of directors, it's easy to get black CEOs, but to drive where it matters the most in terms of the pockets of black people, it's employment equity and skills development. Because when you develop their skills, you also promote them to apply their skills in order to get promotion. And then, of course, procurement and enterprise and supply development. So if you are able to then strengthen those hooks, that's where BE will then start to show you economic growth. But we haven't really used those levers to actually drive economic growth, because we've been interested in the sexy deals, being I've got a 5 billion deal. But when you actually look what goes into the pocket of black people, you talked about the deals underwater. The people that sell the shares get the money. The black people buy hope of dividends to be able to pay in 10 years' time. They might have no dividends during this 10 years. That's why it can never be economic growth. But with procurement, you're able to start your company, you're able to have skin in the game, and you're able to employ people, and you're able to then every single year be able to then get the market access. And where you need financial support, you're able to have enterprise and supplier development enabling you to do that.
Thank you very much. Natasha.
Thank you. The political environment in which the debates around triple BEE are taking place has shifted dramatically since the 2024 election. I'll focus specifically on the two biggest parties and the conundrums they're facing, the ANC and the DA. The DA has basically thrown its weight into a campaign against BEE, triple BEE, from inside the Government of National Unity, which is quite an interesting dynamic, given its participation in the very government implementing the policy. So it has launched a massive campaign against triple BEE, and the risk the DA faces with that campaign is alienating black voters and reinforcing the narrative that it is a party set up to maintain or entrench white privilege. So this is the risk the DA is taking with this policy. That said, with its alternative to triple BEE. That said, at the same time, what the DA appears to be trying to do is to maintain its base. Now that it is in coalition with the ANC, it's crucial that it actually straddles that line. From the ANC's perspective, at its NGC late last year in December, there was a strong sense, a strong sort of doubling down on triple BEE because of the number of attacks that the policy is facing. The temperature around opposition to the policy has been increasing. We saw the new US ambassador to South Africa. He told News 24, I think it was just this morning, in an interview published this morning, that the Donald Trump gave him two, main agenda items for coming when it comes to South Africa. The one being the Iran question, and the second being the US president wants US companies to be exempted from triple BEE. This is not something that South Africa has never done. Microsoft, for instance, wasn't exempted from BEE, but it complies with the legislation through the Equity Equivalent Investment Program. And I mean, this worked really well because from 2020, Microsoft has maintained a level 1 triple BEE rating through that investment initiative. So this is, the pressure there's the pressure from the US. There's also pressure on the ANC and the government, given the developments in the criminal justice system. I know it sounds very difficult to connect, but it is very connected. The Zondo report, the State Capture Commission, made really damning findings about the impact of using triple BEE and manipulating it, and how that enables state capture. We are watching the Madlanga Commission unfold, and it's very likely that the Madlanga Commission will also make findings on triple BEE legislation, given the ability of, or the alleged ability of criminal cartels to infiltrate key government spaces like the South African Police, like the Tembisa Hospital. So those are the difficult political questions that the ANC is facing. The fact that its electoral support it's lost its majority for the first time is also putting it in a difficult position. It has to grow the economy, so it's you know, it has to increase the rate of fixed investment. So this is the thread that was running through that NGC and the debates that were happening there, which is why I think we're seeing Minister Tau undertaking to review triple BEE legislation. He's been speaking quite a bit about that over the last few weeks. I'm not sure whether it's going to be a genuine review or just a box-ticking exercise. We'll have to wait and see. And then the last area of pressure that the government is feeling around the policy is court cases through Sagalika, which is a non-profit body, has taken some aspects of triple BEE legislation to court, and it won one of those cases, I think, in the last month or so. So there are, there is an intensification of the opposition to triple BEE in its current form. Whether we will see a shift in triple BEE in its current form after the review remains to be seen. But we have to remember that the ANC's leadership is also changing at the end of next year, 2027. And that will also give us a stronger indication of the ANC's approach to the legislation going forward and any meaningful reform of the legislation going forward. Interestingly, the Ipsos poll, which News24 had run, indicated that older South Africans were actually less in favor of triple BEE than younger South Africans. And the generation that's about to take over the leadership of the ANC is very much more sort of invested in maintaining the policy than the previous generation. So that's the political environment in which the debates around triple BEE are unfolding at the moment. And it is a space that's in massive flux due to the pressure from various areas.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think that's interesting to get that political context, but what I find a bit hard to understand is, given there is all this flux, and given, it may mean that the ownership and management processes can't change very much because there's too much internal opposition in the ANC. But they also, Parks Tower has been proposing a second process, or the upgrading of a second process. Why not also put that out there and have it publicly discussed? There needs to be a lot of changes, but I think the basis is there for something constructive to come out of it. Why not have it out there, have it discussed, and then start implementing it? Because that I think is the main way in which BE will finally begin to contribute to investment and economic growth. It's going to take some time, no doubt, but if they at least seem to be doing something, it should be important from a political point of view. The DA, their approach I don't get either, but I won't talk about that. But I don't know if you guys have any other comments, but I actually want to bring in Shadiso Matona, who's the BE Commissioner and who's sitting in the audience today. And I just wonder, I can't really see you because of the light, but I don't know if you have anything that you would like to add or say at this moment.
Just so you know, Stephen, I disagree with him even before he starts.
Sorry?
Thank you very much. Khulekani and I used to work together, and we used to agree. So I don't know what happened. No, thank you for the opportunity to say something about a topic of significant importance at this point in our country. So the President, in his State of the Nation address, said that the policy is going to be reviewed. Because whichever way you come at it, that imperative, that we can't carry on like this. We got to make a decisive shift. What the nature of that review is going to look like remains to be determined. And I think it is an opportunity to canvass. So I came here because I was invited as an ordinary citizen, not in my capacity. And I said, let me come and listen to the professors, how the professors view BEE. If I had my way, I would start with a comprehensive review of the framework. Because then it frames what you do with enterprise and supply development, the transformation fund, and that type of thing. So you have this awkwardness because one important part is out there on its own, and then we're looking at the framework. I do believe that the important starting point in the review is that because I listen to the nation and the commentary and the discourse. It's not about the principle. So we're not differing about the principle of doing some kind of a BEE. It's in the application. So I heard that in the earlier conversation around competition. The application, we must change the application, definitely. So first, that's the first point. And I suppose in that application, you want the instrument to deliver better results. Because the current model, we're running in one place. There's a lot of effort, a lot of being invested in kind of working with the framework for little results. Whether the question about results, whether there are results or not, is another important issue. Those who say it's failed, obviously, kind of, nobody can believe that. And I think it's a wrong narrative, I think, to punt failure. It has not really worked well across all elements.
Yeah.
So I agree with a review in the application that improves the quality of the application, the quality of the compliance, and then links it to real economy dynamics in the way that your presentation, Stephen, and some of the comments that have been made link it much more to real economy, macro impacts. There's been a disconnect in that regard. But final point is that let's also be careful on burdening the policy with all manner of economic policy, what you call it. It can't solve for all our economic problems. But I think it's a linkage, and the way it contributes to growth and employment, I think that's what needs to be given much more prominence, and the tools inside it, completely agree with enterprise and supply development, because that's the one area, that's going to give us the greatest sort of results. So let me make those broad comments for a start. Thank you.
Thanks, Sadiso. I mean, just to say that if government is going to review it, or if it is going to be reviewed, I don't think my view would be that government shouldn't do the review on its own. It should bring in other important stakeholders into that process in a very fundamental way. So I think Anne Bernstein had her hand up. I haven't seen any other hands, but go ahead, Anne.
Great, thanks very much. This is a really important conversation, and one which we at CDE are starting to think about a great deal. Let me start by saying that I think the national project, if you like, is transformation and empowerment of everybody in our society. And if you move away from capital letters for black economic empowerment, I think we've got to free ourselves to think more deeply about what it is we're trying to achieve. And it is of unbelievable importance. So I personally would be in favor of a serious review of lowercase black economic empowerment, which could include what my friend my friend over there sort of spends a lot of time thinking about, and he and I were part of a 5-hour review, which was not a review at all. We were lectured for 5 hours. So I am in favor of a serious look at this. I am equally puzzled as to what's happening with the Transformation Fund and why we can't get a document to review. We've been waiting for the second report. What exactly is going on? Is this an election measure, or what is it? I don't know. I think, to come to Natasha's point, the broader environment, it's quite hard to do a review of black economic empowerment when poverty is rising, unemployment is at catastrophic levels. It is hard to talk about this, and when most young kids can't read for meaning. So there are some important issues that the country should reflect on when it comes to empowerment and what impact a lack of skills, education, access to a stagnant economy does for opening up opportunities, which is what this is all about in different dimensions. So I think a serious conversation about this is long, long overdue. But it has to be widened, not because this legislation must apply to everything, I agree with you, but because the bigger topic is really what this is about. And my experience is that for many people, they know that the current approach to empowerment, black economic empowerment, BEE legislation, is not working to their satisfaction. I'm not one of those who says nothing has worked. That would be insane. We've seen employment equity have positive effects. For how long is a legitimate question, but I am not one of those who says that everything has failed. But there is a sort of tone among many people that this hasn't worked, and the reason is because of white companies. They're not doing enough. And therefore, we must double down on the quotas, on everything we can think of. We must double down. And what we need is more money. I think that's one view. There is the DA view, which wants to turn a conversation to poverty. It's not I don't think it's a successful policy myself, but they're trying to turn it in a different direction, but then they end up saying the vast majority of people are black anyway, so let's talk about that. So I don't think they achieve very much. Personally, I think there must be a more effective route to go, but you have to link it to an expanding economy. So Mr. Matswana sort of gave a report where he told us about different sectors and how transformation had what transformation had been achieved in different sectors of the economy. And one of the most successful was the construction industry. The problem is the construction industry is dead. So who cares how much transformation has been done then? This doesn't help the country. So I think we've got to move away from the constraints of capital letters about this and start thinking more deeply about the relationship between economic growth, which is what we've been talking about for 2 days, about labor absorption, more and more people getting jobs, about skills and education, and then we could talk at another conference about cities and access to the cities for poor people. But we're locked in a conversation that isn't very helpful. Before I end, I will just correct you on one thing. The Brenthurst Initiative was not Anglo-American at all. It was a personal family initiative, very different, and that's partly why it failed.
Well, that's interesting to know. But thanks very much, Anne. So there's a question over there. I'm sorry, I can't see your face. But we've only got one minute, one question. Yeah.
Well, okay.
No answer.
I'll be brief. Thanks all. Just to bring, to throw things more in the pot here. As part of rethinking and redesign, and I'm glad that the conversation is shifting towards thinking more about ESD and how we can optimize that aspect of BE, because I think that's actually where the magic might lie. Drawing from our work on particularly barriers to entry, hundreds of interviews with black industrialists, entrepreneurs that are manufacturing widgets in their economy, have built real businesses. Often they say, in a sense, get out the way. We don't need favors. Some say to us, what we need is access. My product is good enough for a pick and pay shelf. The one guy says to us, he manufactures sauces and things. I know it is because it's tested, it meets all the kind of quality criteria. But it took me embarrassing, at the time, Pick and Bessie, I think, was Ackerman, at a conference in public to say you do inclusion, but I've been trying to get on your shelves for 3 or 4 years with no reply, no success. They had him on the shelves in 2 weeks. This question of access is nuanced, and if we could design around that so that you generate the kind of right incentives for wanting to do business with these enterprises, I think would be going a long way. There's a lot of insights from other areas unrelated to BE about what meaningful participation
But you
looks
see, that
like.
this is why this document is actually quite important, because they have 3 criteria: funding, mentoring, in other words, building management skills, which is very important, which we heard about from Carol Newman this morning. We don't know enough about that, but it's very important. And the third one is market access, as you're saying. These things are already there in some vague way on the table, but they're not being talked about enough. But it is being thought about, at least by somebody in DTI, which is a good thing, in my view. And I think we probably have to end, for she, yes. Yeah. But thanks very much to everyone, and thanks firstly to the panel for your very helpful comments, and also to Shadisa, Anne, and Thando. And we will have a break now, or no break? We're going straight into...
So you stay here until this panel...
Sorry.